Well, first of all, welcome to the podcast. Can you tell everyone who you are and what your work is?
Oh, hi. My name is Anne. I'm speaking to you from Concord, Massachusetts in the United States. And I have a background in architecture, but I started to understand that architects don't study biology and how humans function. And so about 10 years ago, I really got into that because living in Boston, it's a biotech hub. And there's just so much research here and so many companies here doing amazing research in biology. And I connected with one of them called iMotions. They'll do eye tracking, facial expression analysis. And once you use those tools with architecture, you see, it just changes how you see the world. And so I did publish a book with a Tufts professor called Cognitive Architecture. And then the second edition came out, Cognitive Architecture, Designing for How We Respond to the Built Environment, came out in 2021 with eye-tracked images of architecture. I think it's the first book in history to have 40 color images of eye-tracked architecture, which shows how our non-conscious animal brain is directing us more than we realize.
We should say to everybody, we have the lovely book, Cognitive Architecture, here, available at all good Amazon bookshops. There you go. And all other places. Couldn't find it in the RIBA bookshop the other day, though.
Well, we need to tell them they need to catch up.
Maybe they do. Maybe they do. Right, so you've used eye tracking and that kind of thing to sort of analyze architectural facades and architectural images, which, as you say, is sort of a novel technique as far as we're aware. What are sort of the main findings of that research?
You have such good questions. That's the amazing thing. Once you use this tool, you'll see everything differently. Like once you put pond water under a microscope, oh my gosh, you see all the animals in the pond water. It's the same thing with eye tracking. You suddenly understand that humans are preset to look at very specific things. So without conscious awareness or control, our brain immediately looks at something red. Without conscious awareness or control, our brain, without our even realizing it, will look for a face immediately. We also look for areas of high contrast. Sharp shapes get our attention very quickly, and we tend to immediately then avoid them. It's really fascinating. What's a little discouraging is how the business schools and major tech companies employ this technology to drive consumption. So that's what's happening. This technology is not being used to build a better world or make a kid feel safer walking to school. It's being used to promote people buying more stuff. And what's amazing to me is how the tech people really know this technology and really just use it to promote consumption. And so one of the things we did found a nonprofit called the Human Architecture and Planning Institute, and our idea is to try to get people to use the technology to build a better world, happier walk to school, safer crosswalks in the streets, all the stuff like that. So, that's what we can do. Eye tracking really, really is amazing, though. Once you see it, you realize we're not as smart as we think. We really are animals. And animals, to survive in the savannah, they had to quickly see faces. They had to quickly look at the color red, or they wouldn't have survived.
Yeah, I think you're right that it's being utilized by a whole host of companies for sort of the normal profit motive, and it would be great
Right.
if the architectural industry started utilizing it for the motive of producing better buildings.
Right. That's exactly the issue. That's a gap. I am a licensed architect, and there was no biology requirement, no psychology requirement to get my degree or my license. So that's crazy making. If you work for Apple, you're going to work with PhD neuroscientists. PhD neuroscientists overview the design of the products as well as the layout of the stores. It's really amazing.
Yeah, well,
The most amazing.
I guess
What?
architecture is because it's such a smaller industry. It's not like not like tech giants. It's not really scalable. That sort of they don't know no practices really have the capacity to employ that kind of professional maybe.
Yeah, or they're more like, I don't know, they're not, it's a more short-term profit industry. They don't think long-term. But the tech giants they have to promote consumption. So they really study how people work and they want to make people happy. when they're doing things, whereas architecture, the term happiness never even came up. What's amazing at business schools like Harvard Business School, very famous international business school, students study emotional intelligence. They even will read books about happiness, words like empathy. I mean, those words never came up.
It's all right. You don't need to be happy in a building. You just need to be like experiencing the awesomeness of it, but not happy.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right. You don't need to be happy in the building at all. So.
Yeah. You mentioned faces because obviously that relates very closely to the eye tracking and the way the human brain sort of experiences a lot of things. What's the significance of faces when it comes to buildings and architecture?
Well, so humans are face-atecs before they're architects. That's the amazing thing. We're just hardwired to look for faces all the time. And there's a term that psychologists like Stephen Porges use, co-regulation. Because we're a social species, we're meant for you to look at me, Bruce, me to look at you, you to look at your friend to look at her mother. We're meant for co-regulation. We're not meant to be alone. So our nervous system is hardwired to see other people. Big companies know that. So most corporate logos in the US look like faces. Even the Amazon logo is a smile. So subliminally, non-consciously, there actually are cells in your brain called face patches that get engorged with blood when they see a smile. The package is not smiling at you, but part of your brain thinks it actually is, even if it's for your husband or even if it's for someone else. You know, you're going to connect more to the package because you're seeing a smile. It's all survival. I mean, our ancestors who didn't immediately see faces on the savannah where we evolved, right? They died. And so the brain and body you have, even if you think of yourself as modern, hasn't changed for 50,000 years. It's the same brain of a primate, a hunter-gatherer on the savannah. So you're hardwired for faces. And the face bias, I mean, they've done studies now on it. It's amazing. Even companies like 3M, giant conglomerates in Minneapolis, 3M, they have 3M visual attention software, which can predict where people look at things. They show that if you put a face below a to buy button versus on to the right of the screen or something, the 60% more people click on the to buy button with a face there. Yeah, that's the other thing. There's now algorithmically, the first 3 to 5 seconds we look at anything is the same as a monkey. It doesn't matter age, gender, language, culture. The first 3 to 5 seconds is non-conscious, and that sets the experience of conscious viewing. Mm-hmm. See, so they've all figured it out. But it's not being used down because in academia things stay in silos. It's starting to infiltrate, but very slowly, academic curriculum. And the psychologists have written about this. There's a famous Harvard professor, Steven Pinker, The Blank Slate, The Modern Denial of Human Nature. He wrote in 2002 how the humanities don't talk about how a lot of the way we move is basically preset by evolution. They pretend that's not there. So we glorify thinking. The car companies don't glorify thinking. They know it's an emotional process. It may seem logical, but which car you decide to buy is the end emotional. And it's non-conscious. That's the big change in 21st century thinking, understanding that the non-conscious experience directs your consciousness, right? So if you see something on a big, heavy table, non-consciously, your brain's going to think, oh my God, that must be important. So if, you see Putin at these huge tables, right? Or you see Queen Elizabeth, you would always see pictures of her in a giant chair. There were no pictures of her on a folding chair or a stool, because non-consciously we think something's very important if it's on something big and heavy. So Apple, when they design their retail stores, this is hysterical. They'll put 10 iPhones on a 300-pound table. You really don't need a huge wooden oak table for, 5 pounds of tech equipment, do you? Yes, you do, because non-consciously, if Apple just put it on a little folding table, your brain will tell you it's not as important. You get it?
Well, does that apply to architecture then?
Sure. Churches look heavy and big and we see them as important, right? Or they're often on the top of a mountain, or, of course that applies. Yeah. Right. things that seem heavy seem more important.
Yeah,
Uh,
I suppose that applies to the sort of classical thing, and it's triggering my brain of like piano nobile and pediments and that kind of thing.
right. Or you walk towards things and it'd be the tallest building would be the most important one. You
Mm,
know, heavy and tall and
yeah,
yeah.
there's definitely more significance to like sort of heavy masonry buildings in people's
Right,
minds. Like
exactly.
that's why banks were always like big and like
That big
heavy
with
classicism and yeah,
giant columns in front of them. Or you see it too with the U.S. Capitol, a huge dome has to be really important.
yeah. Well, that on the sort of the fact that it's the sort of weight of buildings and things as well. I suppose the symmetry comes into that quite quickly as well. I'm very conscious to not go too far down the traditionalist route because I'm not a traditionalist, nor am I a modernist. So I don't want to get like
That's good.
blah blah blah, so and so golden section is all amazing, and then I hate modernism, or the other way around. Like I'm not idolizing anything, so I want to be like scientific about all of this. But let's talk about symmetry. Where does symmetry come in terms of the
Well,
psychological?
symmetry. Well, so they know that that's another bias. They know that perceptually, the symmetrical thing is faster to process by your brain, whereas asymmetry is slower. And then they've done preference studies, even making faces more or less symmetrical. People say they prefer the more symmetrical face. So symmetry is actually tied with health and well-being. If an animal is missing a leg, it suddenly looks asymmetrical, and then it's not as it's connected to, like everything in perception, it has connection with survival. The more symmetrical is considered more healthy, more likely to survive, is preferred, right?
So we're
So you
perceiving buildings that are more symmetrical as more healthy, sort of subconsciously.
Yeah, that's the brain bias, but it can't just be blank symmetry. So like in Boston, you have a lot of these glass blank boxes. There's nothing on them. They're not, the brain doesn't even want to look at them. That's the amazing thing. If you eye track modern architecture, it effectively collapses because our brains and bodies are built for attachment to each other, but also to the environment. Um, and in modern architecture, the brain, especially with all the glass, we didn't evolve with glass sheets. We don't know how to take them in. We can't fixate on it. What's really fascinating is architecture really is about movement, is about moving through a space, because you want to go shopping, you want to go to the church, you want to drop off at school, you want to go see your mother, it's all about moving easily. And in traditional environments, whether it's old Paris or old Siena, it's very easy to make that movement. Why? Because subliminally, non-consciously, your brain's being fed the stimuli by the details in the building that it needs to easily walk along the street, especially in streets in Europe where they've taken off the cars.
Is that
Cars,
is that what you
cars
call
but,
is that
but
what you call thingmataxis?
yeah,
Thing
thigmataxis. Thigmataxis is
thingmataxis.
not me. I didn't invent that. That's really fascinating. We're wall-hugging creatures. So, when I was 23, I went to Siena, Italy, and I don't speak Italian really at all, but I felt so at home it made no sense. But they took the cars out of the central city. It's a narrow streets, kind of a wide plaza, but not too big. You can subliminally, non-consciously attach. We're hardwired for attachment. And what's fascinating, once you know to look for thigmataxis, you see it everywhere. So you walk into a bar or a cafe, like maybe around at 11 o'clock, people will be sitting at the edges first, and the tables that aren't at an edge are filled last. And I've seen that in Hong Kong. I've seen that in Texas. I've seen that all over the world. We're edge seeking. Mammals are that way. It's a protective strategy.
I was going
We
to
don't
say,
have
is
eyes.
that like a security thing?
Yeah, it's a security thing. Exactly. It's a security thing. And it's also, it was really wild. I once watched an MIT student walk into a cafe and there were 30 empty chairs. So where did he pick? The chair he picked was the one that was in a corner. So he had two sides. His back was to two sides. And then your body can relax more. You can think about your homework. You can think about your meal. You can't enjoy a meal well if you are stressed. If you're scared. To really enjoy the meal or to enjoy a conversation, you need to feel comfortable. It was really interesting. I lived in Paris for 5 years in my 20s, and in cafes, you'd go into Paris in cafes, and the waiter would always point the woman to sit with her back to the wall, and the man would sit in the outside chair. It was very, very fascinating culturally how that worked. Well, you want the woman to be more comfortable, right? You'll have a better date, whatever, you'll have a better time. But yeah, so stigmataxis is real. Because you have to understand too, we've got a fear-based brain. And so to socialize and be in community, we have to shut down the fear. How do you shut down the fear? By making places people feel safe. So having significant, edges where someone can't pounce on you. Right.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? It
Yeah, no,
definitely
it
makes
does.
sense. The problem is, especially in America, and I think around the world post-World War II, we just designed for cars. Cars aren't stigmatactic. So we made all these places for cars, there's wide open parking spaces where you just don't feel like you're anywhere and you don't want to get out of the car.
Yeah, that's definitely a problem in US urban planning, that's for sure. And it's a shame the world has copied US planning rather than European.
And that's exactly the problem. It's a huge problem. They're copying US planning, which they shouldn't be copying. It's not sustainable. The stats on this are frightening. I just read from a transit authority, 95% of the time cars spend parked. And so what that means is now 30% of the area in American urban places are car parking.
Yeah, well, we've got the latest iteration of sort of walking and cycling friendly neighborhoods in this country is the 15-minute cities, is the way it's been labeled, which is basically just another version of the same thing that's been going on for ages, which is all amazingly positive, like as long as it's implemented well. But there's a lot of backlash against them as some sort of conspiracy theory, which is quite funny.
Really? I didn't
Yeah.
realize that.
Well, it's because they've not been implemented properly, and there's a lot of local authorities that, without much consultation, have just shut roads and blocked things off, and not really got people on board before doing stuff, which is not the best way to implement something, and then it just sort of makes it worse in the long run, which is a shame because it's all really good stuff, really good urban planning
No,
policy.
it's so important, and we don't realize. I don't know if you've heard of this too. This feeds right into this. Have you heard of the silver tsunami?
No, what's that?
Silver tsunami are the aging baby boomers. Those are the people born between 1946 and 64. In the United States now, there are 70 million of them. I'm one of them. And you don't want 70 million 70-year-olds driving. You
Yes.
really need a walkable city for that. That will increase their longevity, that will reduce car accidents. So we're heading for a catastrophe. They've never in the history of the United States have that large a cohort of people been aging. And that's when you really need safe walking. And so the problem in the United States, even in Concord, Massachusetts, which is kind of ironic, is roads are coherent, but bike paths, sidewalks don't make coherent space. They suddenly disappear. You don't know where the bike path goes to the next bike path. It's completely been designed around the needs of the car.
Yeah. Well, the problem we have in this country is that, unlike a lot of European cities and the US, we don't have a lot of road space in this country. Like, everything's very compact, very tight together. Like, roads are generally only as wide as a car and no wider. And then the pavements are quite narrow as well. So you don't have a lot of space to expand things or build new cycleways or like designated cycleways and this kind of thing. So it makes it a little bit extra difficult to retrofit roads, and even more unpopular when you do, because you have to be more explicit with taking out road space.
Well, I think a country that's done it really well is Denmark. I mean, when I saw how, I don't speak Danish, and I saw how clear it was where the bicyclists are supposed to go, how clear it was where the cars go, and how clear it was where pedestrians go, the way they design the streets with cobblestones to make it really clear where bike lanes are, to make it clear where intersecting streets are. So it can be done, but they've spent, 40 years working on it. And now more people bike to work than drive.
Yeah.
And they're just amazing. And they have higher longevity. I think their longevity is like much higher than the United States. America's now fallen to like 46th in longevity in the world, in part because of the obesity, the lack of exercise, inflammatory conditions. Also racial inequities, all kinds of things like that as well. We don't have national health care, but also because we've built a world for cars, for a species that's meant to walk.
Yeah.
So as I mentioned before, this Harvard professor, Dan Lieberman, explains the male body evolved to walk 12 miles a day, the female 9. And when you don't get that walking in, you're going to get inflammation, depression, loneliness. Your body just can't function as well, and you can't think as clearly. That's the fascinating thing. They know that they've done studies that if people exercise before an exam or walk before an exam, they'll do better than if they spent the past 2 hours sitting.
You should tell all of our students that.
Yeah, but it's true. They know that. So we're meant for, because the brain takes so much of our blood supply, it needs the padding of the foot on the pavement to send the blood up to the brain. So if you're sitting in a car, you can't get as good. Not that we should go for a run right now, but it probably would be a good idea.
Yeah. Well, on the sort of scaling and walkable cities, obviously that reduces the scale of sort of people's interactions. You mentioned in your book the sort of significance of 7 meters as a distance between people in terms of how that sort of where different senses are activated and the way people are viewing other people, and then like 100 meters as the sort of limit of social interaction. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Right. Yeah, that's fascinating, and that's what you see in like Piazza del Campo in Siena. That people are hardwired to see people, and when you go to old city squares like that one in Italy, it's about they're basically built around the limits of human perception, and then they allow for intimate humans to see each other up close, because as a social species, we're built to see each other. And so when we're all in cars, neuroscientists once explained to me, a car is an envelope. It seals you out of your environment. It seals you away. But when we're out in the street that's narrow where we can see another person, our brain is it's what we're meant to be in. We're meant to be in community. And the problem with a lot of modern spaces, they're built outside the limit. They're just too big. So we go into a fear state, and we won't even want to get out of the car. Right.
Yeah, they're not particularly healthy. It's difficult living, like I've felt this, living out in the countryside in the UK. Like practically you can't get to many things without a car just because you're far away. Like I'm within walking or cycling really distance of the local shop and the local pub. But if I want to go anything a little further, like you have to get in the car realistically, just practically in terms of distance. So but then that's very different to most people who live in towns and cities where you are able to do things more in terms of walking.
Right. No, there's just a cost for cars that we're only starting to consider right now, and the cost on human well-being and also on aging. As people age, do you want 85-year-olds driving? Probably not. So where can they live? Can they live in a place where they can walk to get a cup of coffee? In America, probably not. Yeah. And so that will limit their opportunities, and that will limit the quality of their life, and that could impact their longevity. So it all is connected and matters in a way that we haven't really thought about, that we need to think about.
Yeah. One of the more curious parts of your sort of thesis within this book is the PTSD of modern architecture and the sort of founders of modern architecture. And I when I first read this, I thought this sounds a little bit too convenient to me as a thesis, because it's very like, I don't know, it sounds like a very, very direct like mechanism that results in a whole load of things that everyone then copies. Can you tell us a bit about what that thesis is, and then maybe we can dig into the
so what happens
evidence for that
is
a bit.
The reason I never could understand, I'm an American, I go to Siena, Italy, in northern Italy, and I couldn't understand why I felt right at home. It didn't make sense. It makes sense because your brain, reality is a construct between your brain and the external stimuli coming in. And so because of evolution, it's effectively preset what we need to see. Traditional architecture externalizes the stimuli that soothe the brain. So I could walk through Siena knowing no Italian, feeling right at home. It gave me the consistent edge conditions, stigmataxis, the variety, the face-like facades. And to walking is done with automaticity. That means with non-conscious control. You need to have the fixation so that the detail on the buildings, the symmetries, entering knowing that the town hall must be the most important building, the narrative coherence, it all made sense. And then being able to see people so easily and in a car-free zone, it all made sense. It was like you were on Disneyland Main Street, right? So when you understand the brain that way, you look at modern architecture, you think, wait a minute, something's wrong. It's too blank. You can't find the front door. Nobody ever in Boston, what was fascinating, I lived in Paris for 5 years. Americans never wanted to go to the modern parts of Paris. They wanted to walk around Rue de Rivoli. They wanted to walk around the Louvre and the Jardin des Tuileries. They never wanted to go to Tour Montparnasse. Why? Makes no sense. Makes perfect sense because you don't need to speak French and you feel right at home in the traditional part. Why? Because the stimuli are soothing the brain. It's preset what you need to see. There's also narrative coherence. The human brain runs on stories. We need stories. Traditional architecture, even walking into Notre Dame, there's a beginning, a middle, and an end. You kind of know where, the priests will be. You kind of know where the beginning is. It makes sense. You know where the center is. It has a narrative coherence. Modern architecture lacks that. No narrative coherence. You don't even know where you are, and too blank, no detail. Makes something happen. What happened? Well, the problem is, as Margaret Macmillan, she's an emeritus professor at Oxford. She wrote this book in 2020 called War, How Conflict Shaped Us. It was called one of the 10 best books of 2020 by the New York Times. And basically what she writes about is how we don't look at how war gave us our world. Sometimes war gave us good things, like war in the United States gave women the right to vote in 1920. Amazing. War sometimes gives us amazing things. What Margaret Macmillan says is generals realized that having literate soldiers made a difference. And so there was a national movement around the world to teach soldiers to read, educate everybody to read. So World War I, this is mind-blowing. World War I was the first war in history where the soldiers were literate. Amazing. And then you get F. Scott Fitzgerald, and then you get all these writers because the soldiers are literate. Incredible. So you realize with architecture, what happened? Well, a lot happened. There were new technologies because of war. This is an amazing story too. The Germans became expert at ferro-concrete construction. Because they made so many bunkers, because they made so many trenches, they had to learn really fast over 4 years to make things with ferro, with the metal skeleton and the concrete to make it work. Without ferro-concrete construction, you could have had brutalism. The new technologies come from war. We don't think about it. And so, what also happens with war is trauma. And so what we don't talk about, just like Margaret Macmillan says in her book, we don't talk about how war gave us our world. We only are recently now, this is a 21st century thing, we talk about how war changes the brain. So PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, this is mind-blowing, didn't become a word that doctors used till 1980. After Vietnam, they were realizing that soldiers are coming back from Vietnam and not getting better. What's going on, right? And they realized they didn't understand that trauma gets encoded in the body and the brain. And not only that, it can get passed on intergenerationally, 3 generations. That the body keeps, Bessel van der Kolk's famous book, he's the doctor who wrote the book, The Body Keeps the Score. It's all about how your body, your non-conscious body, and even your cells encode the trauma, and it gets passed on. And so what happened in modern architecture is really fascinating. The key seminal people who are called the fathers, like Walter Gropius or Mies van der Rohe, or even Richard Neutra, they were World War I vets. So Harvard hired Walter Gropius in the 30s, not realizing he'd served 4 years in the trenches. And there's a book that came out by Harvard University Press about his life, talking about even after the war, he would wake up screaming in the middle of the night.
Wow.
Right. And so what happened is World War I was catastrophic. And there was led to World War II, and now is leading to proto World War, I would say it, what's happening in Ukraine. Because one of the things that Margaret McMillan says that's fascinating in her book, War, How Conflict Shaped Us, she says, the biggest loser in World War I, she makes this point that France, Germany, and Russia all lost 4 million men. But Russia, by 1917, lost the empire. It lost all its territories, to the West. And that's what Russia, in a sense, has been trying to get back. There was an amazing public broadcasting documentary about the centenary of World War I in 2018, where they said, this is what they said in 2018, the impact of World War I is contemporary, not knowing that Russia would invade Ukraine in 2022. The impact of World War I is contemporary, but it's also contemporary because we now know that the founding fathers had PTSD. Now, when you have PTSD, what happens is because of neuronal death, you lose the ability to process detail. So the human brain actually, there's a neuroscientist named Alexandros Lavdas. He explains you have to see detail to know where to focus and to tell your brain you're safe. So all that ornamentation and that detail that I saw in Italy when I was 24, my brain was seeing it as you're safe here, Anne. I would never walk down the modern parts of Italy of all glass buildings. My brain won't let me.
So what's the evolutionary justification for that then? For being
PTSD.
safer.
So what happens is what happened is after World War I, society collapsed, right? There was mass death of the class that knew how to build, traditional architecture, and new technologies need to rebuild. And with PTSD too, this is the other thing that happens with post-traumatic stress disorder. And I think as a child of parents who survived, they weren't in World War II, they were teenagers then, but they survived it. There was a sense, like Gropius would say to his students at Harvard, forget the past, start from zero. Forget the past, start from zero. Because you have to have compassion here. If you have something horrible in your family, especially in the 20th century, it's changing now, but in the 20th century, people didn't talk about it. You buried the past, right? I'm sure this happens. You don't talk about the past. So there was this idea that we wanted to forget the past because it was too horrible. And World War I within 20 years led to World War II. Right. And then there was this, after World War II, there was this rush to be modern and embrace plastics and embrace cars, and take the wheat germ out of bread. We were going to take the wheat germ out of bread and be modern, right? Not knowing, they now know now that actually we need fiber. If you don't have fiber, you're going to have all kinds of other conditions. We actually need the wheat germ in bread. But there was this rush to be modern, to make plastics. My father's first job was making plastics. Now there's all this catastrophe about the plastics in the oceans. It's going to kill the fish, So PTSD is huge, and understanding that people with PTSD behave in different ways because it's a survival strategy. So and so that's it. So here's the important thing about it. With PTSD, to survive, you dissociate. What does that mean? You have to separate from yourself to survive, because if you start thinking about what it's like seeing your captain be shot in the head in front of you, that's what Gropius lived through. If you start living what it's like watching 125 of your cohorts die in the first 6 months you're in a war, that's what Gropius lived through. You won't be able to function. So you have to dissociate from that. And then you dissociate from others as well. The way you connect yourself, And so what modern architecture creates is what? Dissociated states. You can't walk through modern parts of cities. The amazing thing about modern parts of cities, the modern parts of Boston, I don't know, I might be in Dubai. I don't even know where I am. And when tourist agencies want to sell Boston, do you think they show one modern building? No. They show the traditional, the Beaux-Arts architecture, the Trinity Church, H.H. Richardson. They show the, Paul Revere's house. That's the fascinating thing. So you have to have compassion for what happened. But war did give us our world. And like Margaret Macmillan, the Oxford University professor, says, we don't want to look at it. It's too hard. War shaped us completely. War gave us the internet. War gave us national education. War gave women the right to vote. Sometimes it gives us good things, but other times it gives us bad things, like weapons that could blow up the world, like, the nuclear threat that we're kind of living with right now, that, it's pretty crazy. So it cuts both ways, but you really have to look at it. There's a brilliant quote by a Buddhist teacher, Daisaku Ikeda. He says, "A healthy vision of the future is not possible without an accurate knowledge of the past." And in our parents' generation, our grandparents' generation, often they didn't want to look at the past. There was just so much trauma. Does this make sense?
Yeah, no, it definitely does. It's curious to think of, like, what I'm interested in is how much of the sort of the modernist style came out of those individuals who would have been affected by PTSD. Yeah. And I suppose the vast majority of it, of course, came out of the Bauhaus.
The Bauhaus, well, it's PTSD. It's the idea of wanting to build something completely new. They had to, because what they lived through was fantastically traumatic. It's a survival response. You don't talk about it. But the problem is, when you study the human brain, I hate to break it to you, just like you need water, you just had a drink there, you need air, you need to see detail to regulate the fear-based senses in your brain. And Bauhaus took it out.
Yeah. Why is that, though? Like, why is that, though? Why does the...
Because what happens is because what happens with PTSD, you lose. So the human brain, unlike your cat, for instance, is super, super visual. Your cat has much better smelling receptors, and your cat can see better at night. We're super visual. What happens with PTSD and people like Gropius, what would happen is, with vets, they often suffer from blurry vision. 50% of your cortical region of the brain here is devoted to vision. More of your brain is devoted to vision as a human than any other sense. So my cat has super sense of smell. He can smell a mouse. I can't smell a mouse. My cat can see better at night. I can't see better at night. So what happened is they lost the ability they didn't understand, they didn't take a biology course, right? They didn't understand the human need to see detail to soothe the fear-based brain. Their brain was different. It had changed. The functional magnetic resonance imaging, new technologies that didn't come online till the late 1990s, they show actually how the brain shrinks. You have more spinal fluid in the brain after severe trauma. And because the brain has shrunk, you're going to take in reality differently. Remember, reality is a construct between your eye and your brain. Your cat sees a different world. Because the cat has more infrared photoreceptors, your cat can see 50% better than you can at night. Makes no sense. Makes perfect sense, because they have a different brain. They don't think cats can see red. Why can't cats see red? Cats can't see red because they don't have red photoreceptors in their eyes. We see red. So it's preset what we're going to see. So it's preset why traditional architecture works, why I can go through 16th century Siena and walk knowing no Italian, because it's providing the stimuli non-consciously my brain named. Modern architecture doesn't, because the people who came up with it at a time when the world had collapsed. There was a fantastic need to rebuild, and they wanted to, as Gropius would say to his students at Harvard, forget the past. But that's not how, you can't forget the past. That's not how evolution works, So what we're creating, the trauma of what we're creating this is what's brilliant. You're creating more and more dissociated spaces. Why? Because the people who created it were dissociated. There's a great quote If you really want to understand PTSD, read Bessel van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps the Score. There's an amazing quote. It's brilliant. 5 words. Hurt people hurt other people. Gropius was terribly, terribly hurt. His architecture is a paradigm for hurting other people. He had one daughter who died, another daughter adopted. She talked about how he never saw her. She always felt dissociated around him. So it creates the architecture of dissociation, where architecture traditionally, whether in a church, whether in a street in Siena, brings people together. I felt part of the community in Italy, but that made no sense. It made perfect sense. Modern architecture creates dissociation. Why? Because the people who came up with it were war vets, and it came about because of the trauma of World War I, which we didn't look at because of why? World War II. Even more traumatic. I think, 60 million deaths? 20 million in World War I. Society collapsed again, and now we just wanted to embrace new technologies, plastics, cars, not realizing they don't really fit our ecosystem. And so we're killing ourselves and the environment. In Americans, we have, I think, 30% higher per capita carbon footprint. Look what that's going to do to the future because of our car dependence. So you have to look at the big picture, right? And you have to, and I think you have to have compassion too. People didn't know about post-traumatic stress disorder, and people were afraid to look at the fact we're animals. There's a Harvard University professor book about this, the Steven Pinker book, The Blank Slate, The Modern Denial of Human Nature. He wrote it in 2002. It's all about how the humanities in the 20th century, they didn't want to look at, we're animals, we've got a human nature. We pretend we're just intellectual. That's not true. We're in this. Am I making any sense here?
Yeah, no, you absolutely are. I think you're right. And one of my biggest sort of campaigns is to get science and architecture and evolutionary psychology and that kind of thing actually into architecture schools, to say this is a huge influence on the way you need to think about practicing, and you need to learn what it is and how it influences what you design.
Yeah, no. It clearly is, but the problem is, what I see the problem is, architects just don't have any power anyway. It's the banks that have power. Have you seen the book Zombies, Icebergs, 21st Century Capitalism?
No.
I'll send it to you. It's by a Canadian author. It's all about how 21st century capitalism, it doesn't really care about people anymore. So it's going to build these tall glass towers that people don't even live in, but are used as a way to monetize or just to hold value, finance capital. That's what's happened. And so it's completely cut off from the everyday user experience.
Yeah.
It's become.
Well, I guess the challenge is to incentivize, ideally financially incentivize, the creation of high quality architecture.
Yeah, the challenge is to incentivize health and well-being and community and safe walking for people of all ages, and to get people out of cars. And but it is a problem that we don't understand basically how the brain works, that nature's preset. You need stories, you need order, you want to see kind of organized complexity, face-like facades. It's preset. What's fascinating too is you can go and look at, what I always tell my students to do is do the postcard test. Go to a new city or go to a university. What buildings are on the postcards? What do you think are on the postcards?
All the nice ones.
What?
All the nice ones.
Which are what?
That highly ornamented, significant landmarks, historical significance, symmetry, national significance of program, I suppose. Yeah. Lots of greenery.
What?
Lots of greenery and parkland around them.
Right. So when you go to the Harvard bookstore, you'll see the Georgian architecture. No, there's a building by Le Corbusier at Harvard. Do you think there's a postcard of that building?
So, interesting question, genuinely. What about Chicago? Because Chicago's always struck me as an interesting case, because it's got lots of modern sort of architecture, but a lot of it's very not the same as what we think of when we say modern architecture. A lot of
It's
Sullivan's type
it's old
buildings.
modern architecture.
Yeah.
1920s modern. 1920s modern
Where does
works.
that fit in? That's the question.
1920s works because it has the detail, the symmetry. Yeah, right. It has the detail, the symmetry, what we need. You can see it in the picture behind me. Can you see the picture behind me, the Georgia picture? That's the old State House. That's on all the postcards of Boston. Next to it is the Boston City Hall, the Brutalist building. No postcards. I think they did make postcards of that building, but nobody bought them. And so the tourist magazines, do you think they show Boston City Hall in the tourist magazine? Or do they show the old State House? Which one do they show?
Yeah, quite.
It's right there in front of us what people like, but we don't like looking at it. And the way architecture is monetized and the way finance capitalism works, capitalism doesn't always take in the well-being of the environment or people.
Yeah. So I think let me sort of play devil's advocate for a second. I think the contemporary architects who would call themselves modern architects, who produce architecture that might be sort of soft Scandinavian style modernism, that kind of thing, like lots of natural materials, still minimalist, but very like, I don't know, easier on the eye, less brutal, a bit more organized, not symmetrical maybe, but I don't know, less obtrusive than maybe the sort of brutalism and the original modernism. They would say that style can take into account a lot of the human requirements that you've researched in many ways. What would be your agreement or counter argument to that?
I'd say, okay, I'll just be straight. The foundational thinking in modern architecture is false. The mind is not a blank slate. And modern architecture assumes it is. It's not. It's preset what you need to see. They now know that the template for the face is already active by the third trimester in utero in the fetus. It can recognize the upside down face versus the inverted one. It goes right for the ups. So that's why that Georgian building, the picture of it right there, that's why it's so popular. It suggests a face, the organization, the symmetry, the detail. We subliminally know, it's approachable, whereas the modern architecture is always avoidant. So it's a false, the premises of modern architecture that we're not of nature. Nature's preset everything it had to because the struggle for survival was so strong. And because we evolved in such a precarious place, I mean, the savannah was very active. So you had to know, you had to look for organized complexity to feel safe. You had to look for detail instantly. You had to immediately look at red, right? Or you didn't survive. And so that's what, there's this great quote, the past is never dead. It's not even past, right? We are living in our time, but our brain is of another time. And that's why traditional architecture works.
Yeah.
And I think understanding that we're of nature and we need to respect nature is what bothers me. And because there's just so much finance capitalism in general, it's just about making money. They don't care where the bottles go or the oceans. I go to the ocean now, I pick up plastic. I don't remember doing that as a child. I mean, what's going to happen? It's exponentially getting out of control. You know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
No, but I think it's hard. And I think it's hard because the people who know how to build traditional architecture, there are not that many schools that train people to do that. The finance capitalism likes the modernism better because it can extrude it more quickly. They don't think long term. Yeah, I don't know. But I think reality matters, truth matters, and understanding also, but having compassion for what happened in the past. Wars gave us our world. Wars were horrific. We want to run from them. But we have to understand what they did to us. Sometimes good things, like women getting the vote. Sometimes not so good things, like nuclear weapons, Yeah. And then the dissociated states. But yeah, and I think we need to bridge disciplines, studying architecture, not taking a biology class. That's absurd. That should be illegal. And business schools embrace biology. A business school in Boston, Suffolk University, just opened the most sophisticated human behavioral research lab in November. They're going to have eye tracking, facial expression analysis, galvanic skin response that measures your sweat glands when you see things. And they'll combine all that so business school students know which website, how to design their website. I mean, look how they're thinking. That's business schools.
Yeah, no, I think that definitely needs to be incorporated into architectural education. But it's a challenge because for a creative discipline to adopt science properly when it's not used to doing so is definitely a big leap. It's hard enough.
Big leap. It is a leap, but we can do it, and I think the younger generation is interested. We're having a conference at Tufts, the Second International Conference on Urban Experience and Design. And we're actually having the business school professor that just opened the lab give the keynote there. And it's all about how do you design cities as places people want to be in? How do you make them? And how can you use this technology not just to promote consumption, but to promote well-being? And just to understand also what happened in our past, it's not that you can't build modern buildings, you can, but you have to understand they can't make a sense of place and a sense of community like the traditional buildings do.
Yeah. Or I would argue you can produce non-traditional buildings, but buildings that have the qualities that traditional buildings have, and therefore have the same benefits without being pastiche in the sort of classic way.
Right. Yeah, and I think you have to understand why traditional buildings work. What's happening too is the traditional architecture is often getting expensive, or for people to experience it, they have to pay a lot of money now. So like the island of Nantucket off the coast of Massachusetts, they banned all modern architecture in 1972. It now has the highest real estate evaluations in, I think, the entire Commonwealth for housing. And so only Wall Street venture capitalists can afford to live there.
Yeah.
So it used to be middle-class families could go there. Now, because it's just cobblestone streets, charming houses, everything's charming, whatever. And the other thing that just happened, I just saw a YouTube video about this. Disneyland Main Street, Disneyland Main Street's in Florida, it's in California. They have a Disneyland. It now costs, and you experience 52 different traditional building elevations walking down Disneyland Main Street, which has no cars on it, right? And now it costs $140 a day to get a ticket. So the experience, one reason Disney built the first Disneyland in the 1950s was he realized his daughters growing up in LA couldn't experience a car-free street like he did when he was growing up in like 1900s, right? So he wanted to recreate that feeling, and now you have to pay for it. So we used to just embrace, have streets for people. You know what I'm saying? We've now monetized it, so only the wealthy get charm. Only people who can afford $140 a day can walk down, or maybe it's 150. I don't know. Can walk down a street without cars. That's. You see the problem, Bruce?
Yeah. Well, I think there's definitely an aversion within architecture against sort of cutesiness and charm and sort of pastiche and kitsch is the word we often use in the UK, which has to be sort of gotten round. And I think the fact that we've finally started talking about beauty again, and it's become acceptable to use the beauty word, is at least some progress that maybe we can get to a point where we don't have to be like cutesy and kitsch, but we can consider aesthetics in a slightly more scientific and holistic way.
Yeah, I think beauty is starting to come up, but it was a word that never once appeared on my licensing exam. It never once appeared in my, but I went to school 30 years ago, right? But I think it is, I do hear people talking about it. No, it's really important. The Create Streets, they're talking about it. So beauty is coming back. And the thing is, with these tech tools, with biometrics, you can actually measure it. You can measure stress levels. Before something's built, you can say people aren't going to want to walk down there. But you have to get architects and planners and cities to start asking these questions. And often it's just so complicated, the building process, so much financing involved, they don't want to ask the question. Just like, we used to make gasoline with lead in it. We didn't want to take lead out of gas, or we designed cars in the United States. I don't think cars didn't have seatbelts for the first 50 years. Why put a seatbelt in it? It took that long to realize, you need to have cars with seatbelts. Now we need to have cities and towns where you want people to walk down the street and you want them to feel safe, or you want the buildings to give them a sense of community, right? I think.
So have you ever used the eye tracking tool on a building proposal to analyze it before it gets built?
You can do that really easily. Yeah, you can. You can do that really easily, and you can see immediately. I think mostly we've used it. You can definitely do that. And there's now a plugin for Photoshop. That's a tool, an Illustrator called 3M Visual Attention Software, and that can tell you instantly where people will non-consciously look at the building.
3M Visual Attention Software.
3M VAS. It's a plugin for Photoshop. It became a plugin in like 2020.
That sounds like an incredibly useful tool for architecture students.
Incredible. So I can tell you, can people see the front door? And if you paint it red, how much faster they'll see the front door? Can people see the exit sign? It was developed really for signage, because often people design signs and they put them up and people can't see them because they're not the right color, or there's another sign in front of them. So yeah, it can be used. Those tools can be used before something's built really easily. Really, really easily. And what happens with modern architecture, because it's so blank, the brain basically drives you to look at the ceiling of it, at the top of it. I can send you a few links to that. I had students contrast a modern glass building with a traditional brick building. The brick building, the brain subliminally, non-consciously, instantly finds the door. With a modern building, the brain tends to look at the edge and the edges of the building, because the door doesn't stand out. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah. No, I think the having various forms of software or algorithms that can analyze buildings before they're approved or before they're built, and then spit out metrics that can then be either...
The technology's all there. The technology's all there already. It's just not being used. It's being used to promote consumption. See, if you work for a big company, you need to know that. How quickly does someone see the to-buy button? How quickly does someone see your phone? You don't know that, it's not going to work.
Yeah.
So the technology is already being used, but nobody's using the technologies the way you say. Like, can we use them to design a better school where my 8-year-old will feel better walking to it? You definitely can, but nobody's doing it.
Yeah, well, everyone get on it. If you're listening to this, download all the various plugins and software and start putting your models into them, or your renders. I think that's definitely a way forward. And then you can actually you can say, my building is better because I have analyzed it and this is the outcome.
Yeah, and we're not as different as we think. Otherwise I couldn't walk in Siena not speaking Italian. Makes no sense. Makes perfect sense. I felt perfectly at home because the buildings were giving me the stimuli I needed. It's preset. But we should embrace that. And I just think there's been pushback to embrace our animal nature.
Yeah. Well, and I can highly recommend to everyone to buy your book, Cognitive Architecture. Definitely a good read.
I can also send you to geneticsofdesign.com. That is our blog, which shows some of these examples of how you can eye track things to tell how people are going to look at them. And you can also use it before something's built. There's some great examples of that. But you're right, just exactly what you said, Bruce, this science needs to get out there, improving communities.
Yep. Well, start using it, everyone. It's the future of design.
Yeah, so I'll send you links if you want, Bruce.
No, that'd be brilliant. And if you want,
you're very kind. And yeah, there's also another conference coming up that's free over Zoom. You might be interested in coming up at Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. It'll be talking about the same things.
Okay, so put me the links and I'll stick them in the description to the video, and people can go to them if they want to.
That'd be awesome. That'd be great.
All right, thanks very much, Chad. It's been great talking to you.